The concussion of a rocket-propelled grenade slamming into the outer wall shook the dust from the ceiling tiles, coating the Tactical Operations Center in a fine gray powder. The air tasted of copper and burning electrical wire. "They are through the wire! Sector 4 is gone!" Sergeant Miller screamed, his voice cracking with raw panic. He crouched behind an overturned metal desk, fumbling with a jammed M4 carbine. His hands shook so violently, he dropped the magazine into a pool of hydraulic fluid. "Where is the air support? We are dead! We are all dead!" "Clear that jam, Sergeant," a voice cut through the chaos. It was not a scream. It was a low, flat command that carried the weight of absolute authority. Miller looked up, eyes wide. Lieutenant Elena Vance stood in the center of the room. She was no longer the timid logistics officer he had shoved into the mess hall floor. She stood exposed, ignoring the tracer rounds snapping through the shattered window. In her hand was a pistol, held with the relaxed precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "Get down, you crazy bitch!" Miller yelled. "You're going to get shot!" Elena did not flinch as a bullet sparked off the server rack inches from her head. She walked over to him, grabbed his vest, and hauled him to his feet with shocking strength. "Look at me," she ordered, her eyes dead and cold. "The only way you die tonight is if you give up. I am initiating Protocol Alpha Niner. You are now my gunner." Miller stared at her, the blood draining from his face as the realization hit him. The way she held the weapon, the void in her eyes. This was not a supply clerk. "Who are you?" he whispered. Elena turned back to the door, raising her weapon as the shadows of enemy soldiers fell across the threshold. "I am the consequence," she said. "Now fight." 36 hours earlier, Forward Operating Base Black Ridge. The humid roar of the C-130 Hercules transport plane was a vibration that settled deep in the bones, a constant rattling reminder of the sheer power carrying them across the hostile sky. Inside the cargo hold, the air was cold, smelling of hydraulic fluid and recycled sweat. Lieutenant Elena Vance sat strapped into the red nylon webbing seat, her posture relaxed but perfectly upright. Her eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in a meditative scan of her own physiological state. Heart rate 54. Breathing shallow, controlled. She didn't look like a killer. She barely looked like a soldier to the uninitiated eye. Her frame was slight, almost delicate compared to the beef-fed infantry grunts sitting across from her. Her uniform was clean, too clean, lacking the permanent dust stains of a combat deployment. The insignia on her collar marked her as a logistics officer, a bean counter, a paper pusher. It was a meticulously crafted lie. Underneath the standard-issue fatigues, her body was a map of scars and callous muscle, forged in the freezing waters of Coronado and hardened in the kill houses of Dam Neck. "Hey, fresh meat!" The voice boomed over the engine drone, coarse and laced with mockery. Elena opened her eyes slowly. Across the aisle, a massive sergeant was chewing on a toothpick, his legs sprawled out, encroaching on the limited walking space. Sergeant Miller. His file had been the thickest in the brief Elena had memorized. A decorated veteran, capable in a firefight, but a cancer in the barracks. He had eyes that undressed and dismissed in the same second. "You look lost, Lieutenant," Miller shouted, leaning forward, invading her personal space with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You sure you're on the right flight? The USO show is heading to Bagram." A few soldiers around him snickered, nudging each other. It was the predictable opening salvo of a hazing ritual. Elena held his gaze. Her expression didn't change. She didn't blink. She simply looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat. "This is the flight to Forward Operating Base Black Ridge," she said, her voice even, cutting through the noise without shouting. "Unless the manifest has changed." Miller laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, the manifest is right. I'm just wondering if you are right. Black Ridge isn't a place for delicate administrative types. The sand gets in everything. Might ruin that pretty skin." "I'll manage, Sergeant," Elena replied, then deliberately turned her head away, breaking contact. It was a calculated move. Submission on the surface, dismissal in reality. "Don't ignore me when I'm talking to you, ma'am," Miller sneered, the ma'am dripping with sarcasm. He extended a boot, tapping the toe against her shin. Not a kick, but a violation. A test. Elena felt the impact. Her instinct, honed by years of elite warfare, screamed at her. "Grab the ankle, twist, drive the heel into the knee joint. Shatter the patella." The sequence played out in her mind in less than a second. It would be efficient. It would be silent. It would also end her mission before it began. She forced her muscles to remain loose. She withdrew her leg slightly, pulling it out of his reach. "Please keep your feet to yourself, Sergeant," she said. "Or what?" Miller challenged, emboldened by her retreat. "You gonna write me up? Gonna file a complaint?" The red light in the cargo bay snapped to green. The crew chief signaled for landing. "Strap in!" the chief yelled. Miller glared at her for one last second before leaning back, buckling his harness. "Welcome to hell, sweetheart," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "You won't last a week." As the plane banked sharply, beginning its tactical descent to avoid ground fire, Elena looked out the small porthole. The desert below was a vast, unforgiving expanse of brown and gray. She felt a familiar calm settle over her. Miller was wrong. He thought she was trapped in there with him. He had no idea that he was the one trapped in there with her. She wasn't there to last a week. She was there to hunt. The logistics bay at Forward Operating Base Black Ridge smelled of stale heat and neglected steel. It was a cavernous, corrugated metal structure that amplified the relentless desert wind rattling against the roof. For Lieutenant Elena Vance, the space was an immediate crime scene of military incompetence. She moved through the aisles of shelving units with a clipboard in hand, her boots making no sound on the grit-covered concrete. To the casual observer, she was just a new officer overwhelmed by the disarray. To Elena, she was cataloging death sentences. She pulled a crate marked 5.56mm ball from the middle shelf. It felt light. Too light. Using a pry bar, she popped the lid. Instead of the dense, metallic rows of ammunition packs, the crate was half empty, filled with loose rags and spare uniform parts. She checked the lot number against the inventory ledger on the desk. According to the paperwork signed by Sergeant Miller, this crate was full and sealed 3 days ago. Elena moved to the weapons rack. She picked up an M4A1 carbine, the standard issue lifeline for every soldier on this base. She racked the charging handle and locked it back, peering into the chamber. It was caked with carbon buildup. The bolt carrier group was dry, devoid of the necessary film of oil. In a firefight, this weapon would jam within the first magazine. "You're looking for problems that ain't there, Lieutenant." The voice came from the loading dock entrance. Sergeant Miller stood there, silhouetted against the blinding white sunlight outside. He walked in, his heavy footsteps echoing deliberately, announcing his ownership of the space. Elena didn't startle. She carefully placed the rifle back on the rack and turned to face him. She held up the clipboard. "I'm looking for inventory that matches your report, Sergeant," Elena said, her tone professional and devoid of emotion. We are short 3,000 rounds of 5.56 ammunition. The weapons rack has not been serviced in weeks. This isn't a discrepancy. It is negligence. Miller chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. He closed the distance between them, ignoring the social distance required by rank. He stopped 2 feet from her, looming over her small frame. The smell of chewing tobacco and unwashed gear wafted off him. "We're a forward base, Lieutenant. We trade stuff. We improvise. Paperwork is for the Pentagon, not for the sandbox," Miller said, looking down at her. "You think you can come in here with your shiny bars and tell us how to run our war?" "I think a jammed rifle gets a soldier killed," Elena replied. "I need you to sign this discrepancy report. We need to order a resupply immediately." She extended the clipboard. It was a test of chain of command. Miller looked at the paper, then at her. Slowly, he reached out and took the clipboard. For a second, it seemed he might comply. Then, with a sneer, he ripped the top sheet off the clip. He crumpled the report into a tight ball in his massive fist and flicked it onto the dirty floor between them. "Oops," Miller said, his eyes hard and challenging. "Wind must have took it." Elena watched the ball of paper roll to a stop near her boot. She felt a spike of adrenaline, the combat instinct urging her to strike him in the throat. It would be easy. But the mission required her to be the bureaucrat, not the warrior. "I'll print another one," Elena said softly. "You do that," Miller said, turning his back on her. "Welcome to Black Ridge. Stay out of my way, and maybe you won't get hurt." He walked out, leaving Elena standing in the silence of the dusty warehouse. She looked down at the crumpled paper. They were defenseless, and they didn't even care. Captain Reynolds's office was a testament to stagnation. The air inside the small, repurposed shipping container was thick and unmoving, smelling heavily of cheap tobacco and stale coffee. Above them, a rusted ceiling fan spun lazily, its rhythmic squeak cutting through the silence like a metronome counting down to a disaster no one else seemed to hear. Lieutenant Elena Vance stood at attention in front of the metal desk. She had smoothed out the crumpled inventory report as best she could, but the spider web of creases remained, a physical evidence of the insubordination she had just witnessed. Captain Reynolds did not look up immediately. He was a man worn down by the desert, his uniform loose on a frame that had given up on military bearing months ago. He rubbed his temples, exhaling a plume of smoke from a cigarette that burned dangerously close to his knuckles. "At ease, Lieutenant," Reynolds mumbled, finally glancing at the paper she had placed on his desk. "What am I looking at?" "That is a discrepancy report regarding the ammunition supply, sir," Elena said, her voice crisp, "and a formal complaint regarding Sergeant Miller's conduct. He destroyed the original copy and refused to sign off on the shortage." Reynolds picked up the paper, his eyes skimming over the numbers without truly seeing them. He sighed, a sound of deep exhaustion. He dropped the paper back onto the desk, as if it weighed 100 pounds. "Miller," Reynolds said, the name rolling off his tongue with familiarity rather than reprimand. "He can be abrasive. I know. He's been out here a long time, Vance. The desert does things to men, makes them rough around the edges." "This isn't about being rough, Captain. It is about readiness," Elena countered, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "We are missing 3,000 rounds of 5.56 ammunition. The primary weapons are fouling from lack of maintenance. If we take contact, we are not combat effective." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning. He looked at Elena with a mix of pity and annoyance. To him, she was just a by-the-book logistical officer who didn't understand the realities of the frontier. Look, Lieutenant, Reynolds said, gesturing vaguely with his cigarette. I appreciate your diligence, really, but your support. Your job is to make sure these boys have beans and bullets, not to micromanage how they talk to you. Miller and his crew, they're the tip of the spear. They keep the Taliban off our backs. If they cut a few corners on paperwork or blow off some steam, I let it slide. Morale is fragile out here. Discipline is the backbone of survival, sir, Elena said. Reynolds' expression hardened slightly. And chain of command is the backbone of this army. My order to you is to integrate. Stop waving regulations in their faces. You want respect? Earn it by helping them, not by trying to write them up. The dismissal was absolute. Elena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't fear. It was the clinical realization of a tactical worst-case scenario. The leadership node was compromised. Reynolds wasn't evil. He was weak. And in her experience, weak commanders got more people killed than incompetent ones. Is that all, sir? Elena asked. That's all. Dismissed. Elena performed a sharp, about-face and walked out of the office. The heat of the midday sun hit her the moment she opened the door, blinding and oppressive. She put on her sunglasses, shielding her eyes not just from the glare, but from the prying eyes of the soldiers loitering near the barracks. She walked toward her quarters, her mind racing. There would be no reinforcements, no correction from the top. The base was a house of cards waiting for a stiff breeze. She was alone in a trap, and she realized with chilling clarity that when the attack came, and it would come, she would be the only thing standing between these men and their graves. The sun had not yet breached the jagged horizon of the valley, but the heat was already rising, baking the dust into a fine, choking powder. The platoon was assembled on the gravel strip that served as the base's main thoroughfare. They were geared up for a ruck march, a grueling endurance test, carrying 45-pound packs over the uneven terrain surrounding the perimeter. Lieutenant Elena Vance stood at the rear of the formation. She had adjusted her pack straps to distribute the weight high on her shoulders, a reflex she couldn't suppress, though she made sure to look uncomfortable doing it. Pick it up, ladies. We aren't walking to the mall. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the pre-dawn gloom. He was jogging backward at the head of the column, his eyes scanning the ranks until they landed, inevitably, on Elena. He slowed his pace, drifting back until he was running alongside her. The rest of the platoon watched with malicious anticipation. They knew the game. You breathing hard already, Lieutenant? Miller taunted, his voice loud enough for the squad ahead to hear. We haven't even hit the first mile marker. Maybe you should have stayed in the office counting paper clips. Elena focused on her breathing, deliberately making it sound ragged. In reality, her heart rate was barely elevated. She was accustomed to swimming miles in freezing ocean water with twice this weight. This morning jog was a warm-up. But for the mission, she had to be the weak link. I'm fine, Sergeant, she panted, forcing a hitch in her voice. Just keep moving. Fine? You look like you're about to pass out. Miller laughed. He turned to the soldiers nearest them. Hey, looks like the logistics officer needs some motivation. Let's pick up the pace. Double time. The platoon surged forward, the rhythm of boots on gravel accelerating into a punishing run. Elena let herself lag behind, her boots dragging slightly in the dirt. Every instinct in her body screamed to sprint past them, to take the lead and run them into the ground until they were vomiting from exhaustion. It took immense discipline to suppress that alpha drive. They hit a rough patch of ground, full of loose shale and ruts. This was the moment. Elena spotted a depression in the track. As her right boot came down, she allowed her ankle to roll. Controlled, calculated, but visually convincing. She threw her weight forward, letting gravity take over. She hit the ground hard. The gravel tore into her palms, and the heavy rucksack slammed into the back of her head, driving her face into the dirt. A cloud of dust puffed up around her. "Hold up!" Miller yelled. The column ground to a halt. The silence that followed was broken only by the heavy breathing of the men and the sound of snickering. Elena lay there for a second, tasting the metallic tang of earth. She coughed, pushing herself up on trembling arms. She didn't wipe the dirt from her cheek. It added to the effect. Miller walked over, his shadow long and imposing. He stood over her, looking down with pure disdain. "Pathetic!" he spat. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, he booted the side of her rucksack. The impact knocked her slightly off balance as she tried to rise. "You're a liability, Vance," Miller said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "If this was a real patrol, you'd have gotten us all killed waiting for you. Do us a favor. Stay inside. Let the men handle the war." I tripped," Elena stammered, getting to her feet, keeping her eyes lowered. "You didn't trip. You crumbled," Miller corrected her. He turned to the platoon. "See that? That is weakness. That is what gets people dead. Don't be like her. Move out." The platoon resumed their run, leaving Elena standing alone in the dust cloud. As their footsteps faded into the distance, Elena straightened her posture. The tremble in her arms vanished. Her breathing instantly steadied. She brushed the dirt off her palms, her expression hardening into stone. They thought they had broken her. They had no idea they had just passed inspection, and every single one of them had failed. The dining facility, or DFS, at Black Ridge was a blistering metal box that smelled perpetually of industrial grease, overcooked vegetables, and the sharp, chemical tang of floor bleach. It was the only place on the base that offered a semblance of air conditioning, though the units rattled loudly and barely cut through the stifling midday heat. Lieutenant Elena Vance sat alone at a corner table, her back to the wall, a habit she couldn't break even if she tried. On her tray sat a portion of lukewarm gray mash and a carton of milk that was sweating condensation onto the plastic table. She wasn't eating for pleasure, she was refueling. Calories were fuel, nothing more. Around her, the ambient noise of clattering trays and soldiers talking created a dull roar, but she noticed the shift in frequency the moment it happened. The volume dropped, heads turned. Elena didn't need to look up to know who had entered. The heavy, deliberate boot falls were a signature she had memorized. Sergeant Miller and 3 of his squad mates moved through the aisles like apex predators in a small pond. They didn't get in line for food. Instead, they walked straight toward her table. The air around Elena seemed to thicken, the oxygen sucked out of the immediate vicinity. Miller stopped at the edge of her table, his crotch level with her face as she sat. He rested a hand on the back of the empty chair opposite her, leaning in. "Enjoying the chow, Lieutenant?" Miller asked. His voice was mock-friendly, loud enough to draw the attention of the entire room. Elena carefully set down her fork. She wiped her mouth with a paper napkin, her movements slow and deliberate. "It serves the purpose, Sergeant. Can I help you with something?" "Just checking on our favorite officer." Miller smirked, glancing at his friends who had flanked the table, effectively blocking her exit paths. "You looked a little shaky out there on the run this morning. We were worried you might not have the appetite to keep up with the big dogs." "My appetite is fine," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the condensation sliding down the milk carton. "If you'll excuse me, I have inventory logs to finalize. She stood up, picking up her tray. It was a clear signal to end the interaction. Miller didn't move. He stood directly in her path, his chest acting as a wall. We aren't done talking, ma'am. It's rude to walk away when your NCO is briefing you on morale. Move aside, Sergeant, Elena said quietly. It wasn't a request. It was an order, though she delivered it with the tone of a tired librarian rather than a commanding officer. Or what? Miller challenged, stepping closer, invading her intimate space. You gonna trip and fall again? Elena made to step around him. As she moved, Miller shifted his weight. His hand shot out, too fast for a clumsy accident, too slow to be a combat strike, and shoved the bottom of her tray. The plastic tray flipped. The carton of milk exploded against Elena's chest. Mashed potatoes and gravy splattered across her clean uniform, sliding down the front of her jacket in a humiliating, wet mess. The tray clattered loudly to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence of the mess hall. Every conversation in the room stopped. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto them. Elena stood frozen. The cold milk soaked through her shirt, chilling her skin. Inside her mind, time dilated. In the span of a single heartbeat, she visualized the sequence. Drive the jagged edge of the plastic tray into his throat. Shatter the hyoid bone. Pivot. Elbow strike to the solar plexus of the man on the left. Knee to the groin of the man on the right. It would take 4 seconds. They would all be on the floor, choking or unconscious. But the mission, the damned mission. She forced her hands to remain open at her sides. She didn't wipe the food off. She simply looked up, locking eyes with Miller. His face was twisted in a grin of triumph. The bully who had finally pushed the victim too far. Clumsy, Miller whispered, leaning in close to her ear. You're a mess, Vance. You don't belong here. Elena took a breath, smelling the sour milk on her collar. The rage in her gut was a cold, hard stone. She was no longer analyzing him as a soldier. She was marking him as a target. Are you finished? She asked, her voice dead flat. Miller's grin faltered slightly. He had expected tears, or shouting, or a retreat. He hadn't expected the void he saw in her eyes. Yeah, Miller grunted, stepping back but keeping his posture aggressive. I'm finished. Clean this shit up. Elena remained standing amidst the spilled food. The tension in the room pulled so tight it was ready to snap. The silence in the mess hall was heavy, a suffocating blanket that magnified the hum of the refrigeration units. Lieutenant Elena Vance stood amidst the puddle of milk and mashed potatoes, her uniform ruined, but her posture unbroken. She did not look at the stain on her chest. She looked only at Sergeant Miller. You have made your point, Sergeant, Elena said. Her voice was steady, lacking the tremor of fear Miller desperately wanted to hear. Now stand aside. That is a direct order. It was the wrong thing to say, or perhaps, for Elena's long game, it was the perfect thing. Miller's face flushed a deep, ugly red. To him, her composure wasn't discipline. It was arrogance. It was a refusal to acknowledge his dominance in the only world he felt he controlled. The veins in his neck bulged as he stepped forward, closing the final inch of distance between them. An order? Miller hissed, spittle flying from his lips. You think a shiny bar on your collar makes you my boss? Out here, respect is currency. And you? You're bankrupt. Step back, Miller, one of his squad mates muttered, sensing the line was about to be crossed. Let her go. But Miller was past the point of reason. He reached out and shoved Elena again, harder this time, his hand slamming into her shoulder. Elena stumbled back a step but caught her balance instantly. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. It was a look of pity. That pity was the spark that ignited the powder keg. "Don't you look at me like that!" Miller roared. He lunged, his heavy hand clamped around the back of her neck, his fingers digging into the muscle with bruising force. It was a clumsy, telegraphed move that Elena could have countered in a dozen lethal ways. She could have dropped her weight, twisted, and driven her elbow backward into his ribs. She could have snapped his wrist. She did nothing. She let him take her. "Shut up, bitch!" Miller screamed. Using his sheer bulk, he drove her forward and down. Elena didn't brace for impact with her hands. That would look too trained. She took the fall like a victim. Her face slammed into the linoleum floor with a sickening crack. The world exploded into white light and high-pitched ringing. Pain flared hot and sharp in her nose and cheekbone. The taste of copper flooded her mouth instantly. She lay there, her cheek pressed against the cold, dirty tiles, feeling the vibration of Miller's boots next to her head. The mess hall was dead silent. Not a fork scraped a plate. Not a chair moved. The violence of the act had stunned even Miller's own crew. Striking an officer was a court-martial offense. Striking a woman was a violation of an older, deeper code. Elena remained motionless. Her vision swam, black spots dancing in her peripheral sight. Inside her mind, a cold, mechanical voice was running a damage assessment. Nasal fracture likely, mild concussion, mobility unimpaired, threat level high. Her right hand twitched, her fingers curling toward the hidden knife she carried in her boot. The urge to rise, to end him, to paint the walls with his blood was a screaming siren in her blood. Kill him. He compromised the perimeter of your safety. Eliminate. No, her discipline commanded. Hold. The mission is bigger than your pride. The mission is bigger than your blood. She forced her hand to relax. She let out a low, pained groan, a performance for the audience. Miller stammered, his voice suddenly sounding small in the vast silence. He looked at his hand, then down at the woman lying in the spilled milk and blood. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the dawning horror of what he had done. Elena pushed herself up slowly. Her movements were stiff. Blood dripped freely from her nose, staining the front of her jacket a dark crimson, mixing with the white milk. It was a grotesque sight. She got to one knee, then to her feet. She swayed slightly, putting a hand on the table to steady herself. She took a napkin from the dispenser and held it to her bleeding nose. She turned to Miller. One of his eyes twitched. He looked like he wanted to say something, an apology, a threat, anything to fill the void. Elena said nothing. She didn't threaten him with a report. She didn't cry. She simply turned her back on him and walked toward the exit. Her gait was slow but even. Every step was a triumph of will over instinct. As she pushed through the double doors and into the blinding desert sun, leaving Miller drowning in the judgment of his own men. Elena removed the napkin. She looked at the blood, red and bright in the sunlight. "First blood to you, Miller," she thought, her eyes turning into shards of ice. "It will be the last thing you ever take from me." The quarters assigned to Lieutenant Elena Vance were essentially a retrofitted shipping container, reinforced with sandbags and cooled by a struggling AC unit. Inside, the air was still and hot. Elena sat on the edge of her narrow cot, a small mirror propped up on her knees. The only light came from a tactical lamp she had dimmed to its lowest setting. She examined her face in the glass. Her nose was swollen, the skin across her cheekbone blooming into a kaleidoscope of purple and angry red. It was ugly, but functional. She probed the bridge of her nose with her thumbs. It was a clean fracture, painful but not complex. With a sharp intake of breath, she applied pressure. There was a wet crunch as the cartilage realigned. Elena didn't cry out. Her eyes watered involuntarily, a physiological response she couldn't control. But her hands remained steady. She wiped the fresh trickle of blood away with a piece of gauze, breathing through her mouth until the throbbing subsided to a dull ache. Outside, the world was changing. It started as a low whistle, a mournful sound that quickly grew into a roar. The metal walls of her container began to vibrate. The light from the single window was extinguished, as if a heavy curtain had been drawn. A sandstorm, a haboob. The wall of dust would be thousands of feet high, swallowing everything in its path, reducing visibility to zero and turning the night into a choking void. Elena stood up and moved to her locker. She reached past the standard-issue uniform shirts to the false bottom she had installed. With a click, the panel lifted. Inside lay a Sig Sauer P226, matte black and oiled to perfection. Beside it were 3 magazines loaded with hollow-point ammunition, a combat knife with a serrated edge, and an encrypted short-range radio. This was not the gear of a logistics officer. This was the tool set of a ghost. She checked the chamber of the pistol, the mechanical slide moving silently. She tucked the weapon into the waistband of her pants, at the small of her back, covering it with her loose t-shirt. She strapped the knife to her ankle. The wind outside was now screaming, the sound like a freight train passing inches from her head. Sand hissed against the metal walls, searching for any crack to enter. It was the perfect cover. Audio obscured, visuals denied. Thermal sensors blinded by the heat of the swirling dust. Elena picked up the standard-issue base radio from her desk. It should have been crackling with chatter about the storm. Guard posts checking in. The TUKI, Tactical Operations Center, issuing weather advisories. There was nothing, just a dead, heavy silence. She frowned, adjusting the squelch. Even in a storm, there should be static, the white noise of atmospheric interference. But the line was completely flat. This wasn't weather. This was a hard cut. Someone had severed the landline and jammed the local frequencies. A cold chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down her spine. The hair on her arms stood up. It was a sensation she had felt in Abbottabad, in Yemen, in places that didn't exist on official maps. It was the feeling of being hunted. "They're here," she whispered to the empty room. She moved to the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She didn't open it yet. She waited, counting the seconds, syncing her breathing with the chaotic rhythm of the storm outside. The explosion didn't sound like a movie effect. It was a dull thump, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears, followed immediately by the shattering of glass and the groan of twisting metal. The ground lurched beneath her feet. There was no siren. The early warning system had been neutralized along with the comms. Elena threw the door open. The wind hit her instantly, carrying the scent of pulverized earth and something else, something unmistakable to a veteran of urban warfare. Cordite. The night had been turned into a swirling brown fog, illuminated by the orange strobe of fire. Somewhere in the distance, the distinct pop, pop, pop of AK-47 fire began to tear through the wind. The logistics officer was gone. Elena Vance, the Navy SEAL, stepped out into the chaos. The world outside was a churning grinder of sand and shrapnel. As Elena stepped away from the shelter of her container, The wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, driving grit into every exposed pore. But through the howling gale, the rhythm of the attack was distinct to her trained ear. The crump, crump, crump of 82mm mortars walking across the compound was methodical. They weren't just harassing the base, they were herding the defenders, pinning them down while the breach team moved in. Elena moved low and fast, staying tight to the corrugated steel walls of the barracks. Around her, the base was in total disarray. Soldiers, half-dressed and panicked, were scrambling from their bunks, shouting orders that were immediately swallowed by the wind. A mortar round slammed into the motor pool 50 yards away, sending a plume of fire and twisted metal into the sky, momentarily illuminating the scene in a hellish orange strobe. She ignored the chaos. Her objective was the Teok. Without command and control, this unit would be slaughtered within the hour. As she rounded the corner of the latrine block, she skidded to a halt. Through the swirling dust, she saw movement near the southern perimeter wire, a section she had noted in her report as being vulnerable due to a blind spot in the camera coverage. 3 shadows detached themselves from the darkness. They moved differently than the panicked Americans. They were fluid, hunched low, weapons raised. They weren't running away from the fire. They were moving toward the living quarters. Infiltrators. One of the shadows separated from the group, moving to flank the doorway of the nearest barracks where a group of Miller's men were trying to gear up. The enemy soldier raised his AK-47. Elena didn't think. She flowed. She sprinted across the gap between the buildings. The sound of her boots was masked by the roar of the storm and the mortar impacts. She was a ghost in the brownout condition, invisible until it was too late. The insurgent sensed something, a shift in air pressure perhaps, and began to turn. Elena hit him with the momentum of a freight train. Her left hand clamped over his mouth, stifling his shout, while her right arm hooked around his neck. Using her forward momentum, she drove him back into the wall of the latrine block. The impact knocked the wind out of him. Before he could recover, she kicked the back of his knee, forcing him down. In one fluid motion, she drew the combat knife from her ankle sheath. The blade flashed once in the dim light. She drove it into the soft spot between his collarbone and neck, severing the subclavian artery. The man convulsed once, then went limp in her grip. Elena lowered him to the ground silently. She didn't look at his face. He was no longer a threat. He was an obstacle she had removed. She wiped the blade on his uniform and sheathed it. She checked his weapon, a battered AKM with taped magazines. She stripped it from his body, checking the magazine. Full. She slung it over her shoulder, not as a primary weapon, but as an asset. She kept her SIG P226 in her hand. In this tight, confused environment, the pistol was faster. She looked toward the barracks. The other 2 infiltrators had already moved inside. Gunfire erupted from within the building, screams of surprise followed by the distinctive rattle of automatic fire. Elena's jaw tightened. She couldn't save everyone. If she stopped to clear every room, the TOC would fall, and the entire base would be overrun. She had to cut the head off the snake. She turned away from the screams, her heart rate steady, her mind completely clear. The terrified logistics girl who had been shoved into the floor was dead. In her place stood a Tier 1 operator, and she was about to take command of the night. She moved into the darkness, heading straight for the command center. The door to the Tactical Operations Center was not locked. It was hanging off its hinges, blasted inward by the overpressure of a mortar round that had struck the roof. Elena stepped over the twisted metal frame, her boots crunching on a layer of drywall dust and shattered glass. Inside, The command hub of Forward Operating Base Black Ridge had been reduced to a tomb of smoking electronics. The emergency lights cast a flickering, sickly red glow over the chaos. In the center of the room, slumped over the main map table, lay Captain Reynolds. A piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate was embedded in his chest. The chain of command had been severed at the neck. Huddled in the corner, behind an overturned filing cabinet, were 3 soldiers. Among them was Sergeant Miller. The massive NCO who had terrorized the mess hall only hours before was now a portrait of disintegration. His helmet was askew, his face smeared with soot and sweat, and his eyes darted wildly around the room, unable to fix on a single threat. "We lost the southern perimeter! God, they're inside!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking. He fumbled with his M4, trying to jam a magazine into the well, but his hands were shaking so violently that he dropped it. "Where's the support? Why isn't anyone answering?" The radio operator next to him was dead, slumped over his console. The static from the open channels hissed like a chorus of ghosts. "Sergeant, look at me." Elena's voice cut through the panic. It wasn't a shout. It was a frequency of calm that had no place in this hellscape. Miller looked up, blinking. For a second, he didn't recognize the figure standing in the red gloom. She held a pistol in one hand and a captured AKM in the other. Her face was bloodied from his earlier assault, but her posture was terrifyingly relaxed. "You," Miller gasped. "What are you doing? Get down! They're coming through the breezeway!" Elena ignored the command. She walked toward him, stepping over the debris with efficient grace. She holstered her pistol and reached out, snatching the rifle from Miller's trembling hands. She inspected it, cleared a double feed that Miller had induced in his panic, and slapped a fresh magazine in. The mechanical clack-clack of the bolt going forward was loud and crisp. "Alpha Niner Protocol," Elena said. "Status report. Now." Miller stared at her, his brain unable to process the shift. The logistics girl was gone. The woman standing in front of him held the weapon like an extension of her own limb. Reynolds is dead," Miller stammered. "Comms are jammed. We're cut off." "I can see that," Elena replied. She tossed the rifle back to him. He caught it instinctively. "Listen to me closely, Miller. You are going to take your men and stack up on the east door. You are going to create a fatal funnel. Anything that comes through that fatal funnel dies. Do you understand?" "Who put you in charge?" Miller spat, a flicker of his old defensiveness trying to surface through the fear. "You're a supply officer." Elena leaned in, invading his space just as he had done to her in the mess hall. But this time, the threat was real. "I am a lieutenant in the United States Navy," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "And right now, I am the only reason you are going to see sunrise. If you want to argue rank, we can do that in hell. If you want to live, you move your ass to that door." Miller looked into her eyes. He saw the void there, the cold, calculated violence of a predator. He realized with a jolt of primal fear that the person who had let him beat her into the floor was not weak. She had been restraining herself. Right," Miller breathed. "East door." "Good," Elena said, turning to the other 2 soldiers who were staring at her in shock. "You two, flip that table. Use it for cover. Interlocking fields of fire. Nothing enters this room without paying a tax in blood." "Yes, ma'am," one of the privates yelled, the paralysis of fear broken by the clarity of a direct order. Elena moved to the comms console, pushing the dead operator's body aside gently. She pulled the headset on. She didn't bother with the long-range frequencies. She switched the channel to a secure, encrypted band, one that wasn't listed on any of the base's official signal operating instructions. Base defense is compromised. She spoke into the mic, her voice flat. This is Viper 1 Actual initiating Broken Arrow protocols. I am assuming command. She looked back at Miller, who was now positioned at the door, weapon raised, his trembling subsiding as he focused on his sector. School is in session, Sergeant, she murmured to herself. Don't fail me. The hallway leading from the Tactical Operations Center to the armory was a choke point, a narrow artery of concrete clogged with the smoke of burning insulation. The emergency lights had failed here, leaving the corridor in a pitch-black void that swallowed the beams of their tactical lights. On my shoulder, Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant thud of explosions. We move as a single unit. Check your corners. Do not sweep the muzzle across my back. Miller fell in behind her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He felt clumsy, oversized, and terrifyingly exposed. In front of him, Elena moved with a fluidity that seemed unnatural. She didn't walk. She glided, her knees bent, her weapon, the captured AKM, locked into her shoulder, the barrel tracing the path of her eyes. They approached a T intersection. To the left lay the mess hall, to the right, the armory. Elena raised a fist. Halt! She pressed herself against the wall, signaling Miller to hold the rear. She sliced the pie on the corner, shifting her weight incrementally to reveal the hallway by degrees without exposing her body. Contact, she murmured. Before Miller could even raise his weapon, Elena surged forward. She didn't fire blindly. She entered the intersection with aggressive speed, her body pivoting like a turret. 3 insurgents were setting up a machine gun nest in the doorway of a supply closet 10 meters down. The engagement lasted 3 seconds. Elena fired. Foot, foot. Foot, foot, foot. The sound of the AKM was loud in the confined space, but her control was absolute. The first 2 rounds took the gunner in the chest, dropping him instantly. She shifted targets without pausing, the barrel snapping to the second man who was fumbling with an ammo belt. 2 rounds to the center mass. He crumpled. The third man, surprised by the sudden violence, raised his rifle. Elena didn't stop moving. She closed the distance, while firing, transitioning to her pistol as the AKM clicked empty. She put 1 round through his ocular cavity at point-blank range. The body hit the floor with a wet thud. Miller stood at the intersection, his mouth dry. He had seen combat. He had been in firefights. But he had never seen that. It wasn't fighting. It was execution. It was a mathematical deletion of threats. Elena ejected the empty magazine from the AKM, replaced it with one she pulled from the dead fighter's vest, and racked the bolt. She didn't look at the bodies. She turned to Miller. Clear, she said. Move up. Miller stepped over the corpses, trying not to look at the devastating precision of the wounds. He looked at Elena's back, at the small frame he had mocked for being too weak to carry a rucksack. A cold realization washed over him. She could have killed me in the mess hall. She could have killed me with a spoon. How? Miller started, but the words died in his throat. Focus, Sergeant! Elena snapped, not unkindly, but with urgent pressure. We aren't done. They pushed forward, the air getting hotter and thicker with dust. They reached the heavy steel door of the armory. It was their holy grail. Inside were the squad automatic weapons, the grenades, the ammunition they desperately needed to hold the line. Elena tried the handle. Locked. She signaled Miller to cover the hall and knelt to inspect the frame. Damn it, she hissed. The mortar strike that had hit the motor pool must have warped the building's structure. The steel door frame was buckled, twisting the heavy metal door into the jamb. It was jammed tight, welded shut by the force of the blast and the shifting concrete. Elena kicked it once, testing the resistance. It didn't budge. It was a solid wall of steel standing between them and survival. "It's stuck," Miller said, panic creeping back into his voice. "We can't get in. We're dead. We're out of ammo and we're dead." Elena stood up, holstering her pistol. She looked at the door, then at Miller. Her eyes were hard, calculating, stripping away the problem to its raw components. "We are not dead, Miller," she said. "We just need to knock a little harder." She began to unbuckle the pouches on the dead insurgents' vests, searching for something specific. "Watch the hallway," she ordered. "I'm going to make a key." The hallway had become a kill box. Bullets from the far end of the corridor snapped through the air, chipping concrete off the walls and sending stinging dust into their eyes. The insurgents had regrouped and were pushing hard, realizing their prey was trapped against the dead end of the armory door. "Keep their heads down," Elena ordered, her voice cutting through the din of gunfire. Miller was prone behind the corner of the intersecting hallway, firing short, desperate bursts with his M4. "I'm running dry," he screamed, his voice edged with terror. "I've got maybe one mag left." Elena didn't look up. She was kneeling at the base of the warped steel door, working with the calm precision of a surgeon amidst a hurricane. From her ankle kit, she had produced a small, pliable strip of C4, barely enough to blow a mailbox, but in the hands of a demolition expert, it was a skeleton key. She molded the explosive clay into the gap between the hinges and the frame, tamping it down to direct the force inward. A round sparked off the doorframe inches from her face, sending a shard of hot metal slicing across her cheek. She didn't flinch. She inserted a blasting cap and wired it to a small remote detonator. "Miller, pull back!" Elena yelled. Miller scrambled backward, crab walking away from the intersection, just as a fresh wave of automatic fire chewed up the floor where he had been lying. A tracer round grazed his upper arm, tearing through the fabric of his uniform and searing the skin. He yelped, clutching the wound, and collapsed against the opposite wall. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" Elena was moving before the words fully left his mouth. She didn't dive for cover away from him. She dove toward him. "Fire in the hole!" She grabbed Miller by his tactical vest and hauled him down, throwing her own body over his as she thumbed the detonator. The explosion was a concussive slap that sucked the air out of the hallway. The world turned into a white-hot flash, followed instantly by a crushing wave of pressure. Dust and debris rained down on them like a heavy blanket. Miller lay curled in a fetal position, his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the shrapnel to tear him apart. But it didn't. He felt a weight on top of him, solid, warm, and protective. He opened his eyes. Elena was pushing herself up, shaking the dust from her hair. Her back was covered in gray drywall dust and small chunks of concrete. She had taken the brunt of the shockwave to shield him. Miller stared at her, his ears ringing. Time seemed to slow down. He looked at the woman he had called a bitch, the woman he had slammed into the floor, the woman he had told was useless. And here she was, bleeding from a cut on her face, shaking off the debris of an explosion she had initiated to save his miserable life. A wave of nausea washed over him, not from the concussion, but from a profound, sickening sense of shame. He felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. "Check your limbs," Elena said, her voice sounding muffled through his ringing ears. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her, checking his pupils. "Miller, Are you combat effective? Yes, Miller croaked. He looked at the blood on her face. You covered me. Move, Elena commanded, ignoring the moment. She grabbed his strap and hauled him up. The armory door had been blown off its top hinge and hung crookedly, a gaping black mouth inviting them in. They stumbled inside, the air thick with the smell of burnt explosive and gun oil. It was a sanctuary. Racks of weapons lined the walls. Crates of ammunition were stacked on the floor. The same crates Elena had tried to inventory before Miller had torn up her report. Elena didn't waste a second. She moved to the heavy weapons rack. She grabbed an M249 SAW, squad automatic weapon, checking the feed tray and slamming a 200-round drum into place. She grabbed 2 more drums and slung them over her shoulder. She turned to Miller, who was staring at his hands, looking lost. Elena walked over to him and shoved the heavy machine gun into his chest. The weight of the weapon forced him to stagger back a step, grounding him in reality. "I don't need an apology, Sergeant," Elena said, her voice hard as steel. "I need a gunner. Take this. We are going to the roof." Miller gripped the weapon. The cold steel felt real. The shame was still there, burning in his gut, but it was being replaced by something else. A desperate need to prove he was worth saving. "Yes, ma'am," Miller said. It was the first time he had said it without a trace of irony. "Good," Elena said, racking the slide of a fresh M4 for herself. "Follow me. We have a war to finish." The access ladder to the communications tower was a skeleton of rusted steel clinging to the side of the command building, vibrating violently in the howling gale. Below, the battle for forward operating base Black Ridge had devolved into a series of chaotic, close-range skirmishes. "Set up the saw here," Elena shouted over the wind, pointing to a pile of sandbags near the base of the ladder. "Suppress anyone trying to cross the courtyard. Do not let them look up." Sergeant Miller nodded, slamming the bipod of the M249 squad automatic weapon onto the sandbags. He looked at the ladder, then at Elena. The structure disappeared into the swirling brown dust above them. It was a suicide climb. "If you fall," Miller started. "Just keep shooting, Miller," Elena cut him off. She holstered her pistol and gripped the cold rungs. She began to climb. The wind at 30 feet was exponentially worse than on the ground. It tore at her clothes and threatened to peel her fingers from the steel. Sand blasted her face, stinging like buckshot. Elena kept her eyes focused on the next rung, her world narrowing down to a rhythm of hand-over-hand movement. Below her, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of Miller's machine gun began, a comforting baseline to her ascent. At 50 feet, the platform of the watchtower loomed above her. The trap door was open. Elena paused, hooking her leg through a rung to secure herself. She drew her combat knife. The space up there was tight, a 6x6 box. A gun would be a liability if the enemy was close. She took a breath, timing her move with a gust of wind to mask the sound. She pulled herself up, cresting the edge of the platform. A figure was crouched in the corner, silhouetted against the flashing lights of the battle below. It was an insurgent sniper, his Dragunov rifle resting on the railing, aiming down at her team. He sensed her presence a fraction of a second too late. As he spun around, bringing the long rifle barrel to bear, Elena lunged. She didn't have the leverage for a clean takedown. The insurgent panicked and fired blindly. The rifle cracked, a deafening sound in the small space. Elena felt a sledgehammer blow to her left shoulder. The bullet passed through the fleshy part of her deltoid, spinning her around and nearly knocking her off the platform. Pain, white-hot and searing, exploded in her nerve endings. She grit her teeth, swallowing a scream. Using the momentum of the spin, she lashed out with her right hand. The serrated blade of her knife caught the man in the thigh, severing the femoral artery. He screamed, dropping the rifle and clutching his leg. Elena didn't hesitate. She stepped in close, ignoring the fire in her shoulder, and drove the pommel of the knife into his temple. The man collapsed instantly, his body sliding down the railing. Elena sagged against the metal wall of the tower, clutching her bleeding shoulder. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The wind whipped her hair across her face, sticking to the sweat and blood. She looked at the wound. It was a through and through, messy, but no bone was shattered. "Focus," she hissed to herself. "The job isn't done." She dragged herself to the communications relay box bolted to the center mast. The panel had been shot open, the wires sparking. The backup generator switch was tripped. Her left arm was useless, hanging limp at her side. Working with only her right hand, she forced the heavy breaker switch back into the on position. The hum of electricity returned, a low vibration under her boots. Next, the radio. She pulled the encrypted handset from its cradle. The green light on the console flickered, then held steady. The link to the satellite network was re-established. Elena keyed the mic. Her voice was weak but clear. Any station. This is Viper 1 actual at Grid Bravo Kilo 67. We are overrun, requesting immediate close air support." Static hissed in her ear. Then a voice cut through, calm, American, and godlike. "Viper 1, this is Havoc 2-0 on station. We read you loud and clear. What is your situation?" Elena looked down at the base below. The muzzle flashes were getting closer to the talk. Miller's gun had gone silent. He was either reloading or dead. "Havoc, we have enemy combatants inside the wire. Danger close is authorized. I repeat, danger close authorized." "Copy, Viper 1. Give us a mark." Elena leaned over the railing, staring into the abyss of the storm. "Broken arrow," she whispered into the mic, invoking the code for a unit facing imminent destruction. "Broken arrow. Target my position." "Havoc 2-0. Time to target is 30 seconds. Keep your heads down, Viper." The pilot's voice in Elena's earpiece was the only stable thing in a universe that was rapidly disintegrating. From her vantage point on the tower, the battlefield was a confused mosaic of muzzle flashes and shadows. The insurgents, realizing the command center was still active, had abandoned their stealth. They were pouring everything they had into the base of the tower and the talk entrance. Elena pressed her good hand against the railing to steady herself. Her left arm was numb, a dead weight hanging at her side, blood soaking through her sleeve and dripping onto the metal grating. Her vision blurred at the edges, the loss of blood beginning to collect its toll. 30 seconds, she gritted out, transmitting to the ground team. "Miller, get them inside! Now!" Below, the courtyard was a kill zone. The sandbags where Miller had set up the saw were being chewed apart by concentrated RPK fire. Sergeant Miller heard the command through the roar of battle. He was huddled behind the remnants of the sandbag wall, his barrel hot enough to blister skin. To his right, about 15 meters away in the open, a young Private Jenkins, was screaming. He had been hit in the leg while trying to run for the door and was pinned down, exposed. In the old world, the world of yesterday, Miller would have stayed put. He would have justified it as tactical prudence. Save yourself to fight another day. But the image of the small logistics officer climbing a suicide ladder with a pistol flashed in his mind. The way she had covered his body with hers during the explosion. Something inside Miller broke. Or perhaps for the first time, It was forged. "Covering fire!" Miller roared to the two men left in the doorway. He didn't wait for an acknowledgement. He stood up into the teeth of the enemy fire. He unleashed a long, sustained burst from the M249, sweeping the enemy positions near the perimeter wire. The belt fed through the weapon violently, brass casings spraying like a fountain. "Move!" he screamed at himself. He dropped the heavy gun and sprinted across the open ground. Bullets kicked up geysers of dust around his boots. He reached Jenkins, grabbed the kid by the drag handle of his vest, and hauled him backward. "I got you! I got you!" Miller grunted, his lungs burning. He dragged the private back to the concrete lip of the TOC entrance just as a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the spot where Jenkins had been lying. The blast wave threw them both through the doorway, tumbling onto the debris-strewn floor. "Sergeant?" Jenkins wheezed, looking up at Miller with wide, terrified eyes. Miller checked the kid. Alive. He looked at his own hands. They were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from doing the job. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled the teeth in their skulls. The distinct, terrifying brrrr-tee of a GAU-8 Avenger 30mm cannon ripped through the night air. Above them, two A-10 Thunderbolt II attack aircraft, the Warthogs, came out of the storm like vengeful prehistoric beasts. They descended on the enemy coordinates Elena had provided. The impact was catastrophic. The desert floor outside the wire erupted as thousands of depleted uranium rounds churned the earth and everything standing on it into dust. The sound of the cannon fire arrived a split second after the impacts, a delayed thunder that signaled the end of the conversation. On the tower, Elena watched the devastation with detached, heavy eyes. The strafing run was surgically precise, cutting a line of fire exactly where the enemy mass was thickest. "Good effect on target," she whispered into the mic, her voice barely a rasp. "Havoc, clear for re-attack, west to east." The planes banked sharply, their engines screaming as they circled back for a second pass. The surviving insurgents didn't wait. The psychological terror of the A-10s broke their will instantly. The firing stopped. The shadows fled back into the deep desert darkness, leaving their dead behind. Elena slumped against the railing, the adrenaline finally crashing. She watched the Warthogs circle overhead, their navigation lights blinking like guardian angels in the dust storm. She let the handset slide from her fingers. The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire. It was over. The sun that rose over the Black Ridge Valley was cruel in its clarity. It bathed the scarred compound in a harsh, white light that exposed every bullet hole, every crater, and every drop of dried blood. The dust storm had vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a silence so profound it made the ears ring. That silence was broken by the thumping rhythm of rotor blades. Two CH-47 Chinooks and a pair of Black Hawk medevac helicopters descended onto the landing zone, kicking up fresh clouds of sand. The Quick Reaction Force, QRF, had arrived, 6 hours too late to save the base, but just in time to witness the miracle of its survival. Lieutenant Elena Vance sat on the edge of a concrete planter near the ruined TOC entrance. A combat medic was working on her shoulder, cutting away the blood-stiffened fabric of her uniform to pack the wound. She sat with a rigid, stoic posture, staring at the horizon behind her dark aviator sunglasses. She refused the stretcher. She refused the morphine. A few yards away, Sergeant Miller sat on the ground, his back against a wall. His hands were wrapped in bandages where the hot barrel of the machine gun had blistered his skin. He wasn't looking at the arriving troops. He was looking at Elena. He watched her with a mixture of confusion and a dawning, terrible realization. The way she sat, the way she ignored the pain, the way she had commanded the radio, it didn't fit the narrative he had built in his head. The logistics girl was a fiction. The woman sitting there was something else entirely. A group of officers from the QRF strode toward the command center, led by a lieutenant colonel in full battle rattle. He looked around the scene of devastation, taking in the piles of enemy bodies at the perimeter and the choke points. The colonel spotted Elena. He stopped, his eyes widening slightly. He didn't walk over to her, like a superior checking on a subordinate. He approached her with the brisk respect reserved for a peer of high standing. "Vance?" the colonel asked, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Elena stood up, waving the medic away. She winced slightly but snapped a sharp salute with her good hand. "Colonel," she replied. "I heard the transmission," the colonel said, returning the salute and then extending his hand. "When they said a logistics officer called in a broken arrow, I thought it was a mistake. I didn't know Naval Special Warfare had an asset on the ground." Miller's head snapped up. Naval Special Warfare. The words hit him like a physical blow. "I was assessing security vulnerabilities, sir," Elena said, her voice flat and professional, though the assessment phase concluded a bit early. The colonel let out a short, incredulous laugh, looking at the dead insurgents lined up near the gate. "I'd say. You held this rock with a skeleton crew and no comms against a company-sized element. That's some Trident-level work, Lieutenant." Trident, the symbol of the Navy SEALs. Miller felt the blood drain from his face. The pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity. The discipline, the silence, the way she had taken the beating in the mess hall without flinching. She hadn't been afraid of him. She had been protecting him from herself. She was a Tier 1 operator, a lethal weapon wrapped in a deceptively small package, and he had treated her like a servant. He had kicked a SEAL in the face. He had called a SEAL a bitch. The shame was absolute. It was a cold, heavy stone in his gut that made him want to crawl into one of the mortar craters and disappear. Around them, the other surviving soldiers of the platoon, the ones who had laughed at her during PT, the ones who had snickered when Miller tripped her, were now staring at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. The revelation stripped them naked. Their masculinity, their bravado, their warrior culture crumbled before the reality of true quiet professionalism. "We have a bird spinning up to take you to Bagram for surgery," the colonel said. "Your team is waiting for the debrief." "Thank you, sir," Elena said. "I'll grab my gear." She turned and walked past Miller. She didn't look at him. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. To her, he was just another detail in the landscape of the mission, a variable that had been managed. Miller opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything, to bridge the abyss he had dug between them. "Lieutenant." Elena paused. She didn't turn her head. She just waited, a statue of indifference. The words died in Miller's throat. What could he say? "Sorry I assaulted you? Sorry I'm a fraud?" Elena waited one beat, then two. When silence was the only answer, she started walking again, her boots crunching on the gravel, leaving him behind in the dust of his own making. The dual rotors of the CH-47 Chinook sliced through the hot desert air, creating a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the chest of every soldier standing on the landing zone. The wash from the blades kicked up a miniature sandstorm, stinging the skin and forcing eyes to squint. But Lieutenant Elena Vance walked toward the open ramp with steady, unwavering steps. She carried her gear bag over her good shoulder. Her left arm was immobilized in a sling, tight against her chest. She looked small against the backdrop of the massive transport aircraft, yet her presence seemed to dwarf the machine itself. Sergeant Miller watched her go. He stood 10 yards back, his boots rooted to the gravel. The bandage on his burned hand throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He felt a desperate, clawing need to say something. The silence between them felt louder than the engines. If she left now without a word, the shame of what he had done, the memory of his boot hitting her face, of his voice calling her weak, would fester inside him forever. He needed her to yell at him, to court-martial him, or perhaps, selfishly, to absolve him. "Lieutenant!" Miller yelled, his voice torn away by the wind. He took a step forward, then broke into a run, ignoring the warnings of the loadmaster standing by the ramp. Elena stopped. She didn't turn immediately. She paused with one boot on the metal ramp, sensing the movement behind her. Slowly, she pivoted. Miller skidded to a halt a few feet away, breathless. Up close, the bruising on her face from where he had slammed her into the floor was vividly, horribly colorful against her pale skin. It was a map of his own ignorance. Miller started, shouting to be heard over the turbine whine. "I didn't know. The boys, we didn't know." It was a pathetic defense, and he knew it as soon as the words left his lips. Ignorance was no excuse for cruelty. Elena looked at him. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were completely exposed for a brief second. There was no anger in them. There was no vindictiveness. There was only a profound, professional detachment. She looked at him not as a man who had hurt her, but as a liability she had successfully neutralized and an asset she had successfully saved. "It doesn't matter what you knew, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was not loud, but her enunciation was so precise that Miller read the words on her lips more than he heard them. "It matters what you did." Miller flinched. "I owe you my life. The whole platoon does." "Keep it," Elena replied simply. "Do something better with it next time." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her aviator sunglasses. With a deliberate, slow motion, she slid them onto her face. The black lenses covered her eyes, hiding her soul from him, sealing her back into the anonymous machinery of warfare. The barrier was up. The new girl was gone. The operator had returned to the shadows. She turned around and walked up the ramp into the dark belly of the beast. Miller stood frozen. He wanted to call out again, but the loadmaster was already raising the hydraulic ramp. The metal door hissed shut, sealing Elena Vance away from the world of Black Ridge forever. The engines roared to full power. The massive helicopter lurched upward, defying gravity, and banked sharply toward the south. Miller shielded his eyes against the flying grit, watching the aircraft shrink into a black speck against the blinding white sun. He felt hollowed out. He had wanted a fight, or a forgiveness, something to balance the scales. Instead, she had given him nothing but his own survival. He looked down at his hands. He was alive. Jenkins was alive. The base was standing. And the woman who had done it all had walked away without waiting for a thank you, leaving him with the crushing weight of a truth he would have to carry for the rest of his career. The strongest warriors are often the ones you never see coming. Miller spat into the dust, wiped his face, and turned back to the ruined base. "All right," he muttered to the empty air, his voice rough with a new kind of respect. "Let's get back to work."